kind of played into that.
Quite warm.
Very warm in here.
It's not saying, you're saying we're a kangaroo court. Oh, we'll prove to you that we're not.
Exactly. And that's what very short.
That's very good. Well, that's why I'm not lucky to do it. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Awesome, Clive.
Cheers.
I would love some, yeah, thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much for coming. We'll start off in just a couple of seconds if you're all ready for us. So I'll begin by asking members to put on record any interest they may have, then I'll come over to you to introduce yourselves before we begin on the questions. Okay? All right. Okay, thanks. 5, 4, 3. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Select Committee. It's a further evidence session we've got this afternoon in the reform of the private rent sector. Since we last had our evidence sessions, the government has moved on somewhat and produced a bill now for us to have a further idea about what their intentions are following on the white paper from last year. So we've got 2 sessions this afternoon. Before I come on and introduce, or ask themselves to introduce, the first panel, and then following that the Minister, I'll ask members of the committee to put on record any interest they may have that may be directly relevant to this inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. Okay.
I employ a councillor.
I'm Vice President of the Local Government Association. I employ councillors in my office. I'm also a private sector landlord.
The same, but I'm not a landlord.
Right. Andrew.
I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association, and I'm Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Private Rented Sector, for which the National Residential Landlords Association provides the Secretariat.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you to our witnesses for coming this afternoon to give evidence to us. Could I just go down the table and ask you to introduce yourselves and just say the organisation you're representing?
Cool. It's Richard Blakeway. I'm the Housing Ombudsman at the Housing Ombudsman Service.
Tarun, Bhakta, Policy Manager at Shelter.
Ben Beadle, Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association.
Right. Thank you very much for coming. Just a general question. What do you think is the single biggest issue that in the private rental sector that the government needs to address, particularly if you think there are those which they aren't addressing? Who would like to begin? Ben, yes.
Housing supply. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in the Renters Reform Bill, but I'm afraid it's some stuff that needs a nip and a tuck, but this has all the hallmarks of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Rome is burning. We don't have enough homes for people. We have a supply and demand imbalance, and we need to take urgent steps to not just build social housing, but also to make the private rented sector an attractive place to be.
Yeah, sure. We think it's security. The cornerstone of the Renters Reform Bill obviously is the scrapping of Section 21, and we're pleased to see that being abolished. We think, though, that there are loopholes and potential weaknesses in the bill, which I'm sure we'll come to later, that can be improved and addressed as the bill goes through its next stages. I think also wanted to take this opportunity to say it's been nearly 2 months now since the first reading of the bill. It's looking like we won't get to the second reading or committee stage till the autumn now, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to urge everyone here and the government to ensure that the bill gets its next stages of scrutiny and gets over the line before the next general election, because renters are waiting for this change.
Richard.
I think there's 3 interconnected issues around standards, enforcement and scale, and I think the white paper did a really effective job actually of spelling out the private rented sector we have, which is probably not the private rented sector that was envisaged when legislation came in the 1980s. But it might not be the private rented sector we have over the next few years either, because clearly the sector itself is going through quite significant change at the moment. There's clearly been a gap around access to redress and enforcement of standards that exist. The Landlord and Tenant Act, which is a cornerstone of our work as an ombudsman, and there is hardly a cigarette paper, particularly after this white paper in the bill, in terms of the standards expected. but there has been a gap at trying to ensure that there's effective redress and ensure that standards are met. And that's something that needs to be urgently closed.
Right, I think we'll come on and explore those issues in particular, Richard. Right, are there any unintended consequences for all the good intentions, which might well improve many aspects of the current arrangements in the private rent sector? Are there any unintended consequences that you want to draw attention to at this stage? Yes,
yeah, well, I think there are a couple. You know, it's a far-reaching bill, and as I say, I think there's a lot to be welcomed. We'd like to see some changes around students and around making sure that the courts can support these systems. But the unintended consequences are really that we have no clear plan as to timeframes. What's within scope? Take the Ombudsman, for example. Well, what sorts of disputes are going to be covered? You know, we can welcome an Ombudsman, but we need to have certainty. And I'm afraid the only thing that we have at the moment is uncertainty. So we do need to see more clarity around some of the details that are in the bill. Because I think if you take the external factors around increasing mortgage costs and taxation and increasing rents, actually there are landlords that are out there that are thinking about their investments, and we don't want that. We need to keep landlords in the sector. And the second thing is, as we move to a fault-based environment, is the impact that could have in terms of repossession grounds on renters and being able to access homes if they do have their home repossessed. It's not quite as easy to present yourself to the local council to get a property if you have a CCJ or you've made yourself intentionally homeless because you haven't paid your rent or you've committed antisocial behaviour. Those are the two significant ones, Clive, for us.
Yeah, I would agree with some of that. I think, that last point that Ben made there around, CCJs and homelessness applications, I think that's really, for us, a really, really strong argument for ensuring that the grounds are robust as possible. And we understand that, there are concerns from certain landlords and certain people in the sector about landlords' abilities to regain possession of their homes. But the risk there that in response to things like court delays and challenges in getting things through the court, that the eviction grounds are weakened to a level that is too low, there is serious risks of unintended consequences there, in the sense that it may create loopholes for landlords who look to abuse the eviction grounds, where they see, some of the eviction grounds, perhaps the arrears grounds or the antisocial behaviour grounds, but probably most importantly the landlord moving in or sale grounds, where there's opportunity to abuse those grounds, where there are weaknesses there, that in designing the grounds as the way they have in response to concerns about courts, which really is a kind of a different issue, needs to be addressed through different measures. There's a risk of unintended consequences that we see unfair or no-fault evictions by the back door after Section 21 is gone. So I think that's an important one that we wanted to highlight.
The white paper did a really good job at setting out what benefit an ombudsman could bring to the sector. I don't think the bill as drafted, though, goes as far enough to meet those expectations. I think the term ombudsman is not used in the bill, notwithstanding the fact that only last year in the Building Safety Act we saw the term ombudsman used, and there's also a risk of redress schemes. Now, whilst the government's been really clear, and it's welcome that that's not their intention, I think were that the route they went down, there's a real risk of unintended consequences, because the more you salami slice redress, the more people will fall through gaps, and particularly vulnerable people will fall through gaps. I think there's also a risk of a two-tier system to redress emerging. To be really, really clear, we are set up as a landlord-tenant scheme. We were set up as that in the 1990s with a mandatory social landlord membership, but a voluntary private landlord membership. That was at a time it was probably never envisaged that we'd have the scale of the sector that we have today. But if you go down different routes, what you'll end up with is not only confusion for the consumer and issues around access, you'll end up with a loss of impact, a lack of consistency, and a lack of clarity around how essentially the same rule set is being interpreted. You know, the Landlord and Tenant Act from 1985, the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation, the Health and Safety Rating System, potentially the Decent Home Standard. There isn't a cigarette paper between the standards a social landlord's meant to meet and the standards that a private landlord is meant to meet. And therefore, you need a single place, both that's easy to access, but also provides consistent decision making. And I think there's also, briefly, a risk of a kind of big bang moment, because I'm sat here frustrated that I have a voluntary mechanism by which landlords can join, but everyone's waiting to see what happens. Ben referred to uncertainty. Actually, that's not, use that voluntary mechanism to start onboarding landlords now, rather than waiting for a big bang moment, which could just see real confusion and
I think you want to explore some of these issues a bit further.
I do. Before I do, Tarun, you mentioned the unintended consequences of abolishing Section 21. Sorry, it's Tarun. Sorry, I want to address first. Then I'll come to you, Richard, if I may. If we get to a point where people are being evicted under Section 8, do you accept the fact that the consequence for the tenants will be probably county court judgments against them, and potentially a position whereby landlords will be saying, you're too big a risk, I'll take you as a tenant, but I want 12 months deposit or something ridiculous, which people won't be able to afford. And that's potentially the unintended consequence, which we need to guard against.
That's certainly one of the unintended consequences we need to guard against. Again, I think it's particularly a concern if we are designing the eviction grounds in a way that is too weak to protect renters against unfair evictions. We do understand the concern about county court judgments. I think to answer the latter part of your question around landlords' wariness to let to renters with those judgments and renters with different circumstances, we're waiting for clauses in the bill around anti-discrimination clauses, essentially, as we see them. So bans on...
Can I just be clear then? Because I want to get it on record from you guys, if I may. If there were to be included clauses on, as you say, on discrimination, someone who's got a county court judgment against them for non-payment of rent, does Crisis accept that is perfectly reasonable if the court has found there were severe rent arrears?
Shelter, firstly.
Sorry, shelter.
That's okay. I think it's something that's going to have to be looked at and addressed in the bill. It clearly is a risk.
It's a huge risk, which is concerning a lot of us, I think.
Sure.
To make sure we get something in the bill that is clears up the matter.
That would be good.
Can I come in? Just to be clear, Bob, it's not discrimination if a landlord has...
I understand that. It's a legal question.
No, but I just want to point it out that if a tenant's got a CCJ, they haven't paid, they've committed antisocial behaviour, and that's borne out through the court system, a landlord is perfectly within their rights to decline that tenant. That's not discrimination.
Or set conditions, yeah.
Indeed.
Richard, could I take up the issue of the new Ombudsman role? Because clearly there must be a concern in your mind, as you were saying, that the position was set up in the 1990s and clearly didn't actually have the impact overall that is expected. How do you see that the new Ombudsman impacting the work that you do?
Yeah, I think, regardless of whether HOS provides mandatory redress for private landlords, it will have an impact on us. Because at the moment, about 1 in 5 people who approach us, we're not able to help because their landlord or their issue is not in our jurisdiction. And given we have about a 70% awareness rate as an ombudsman, I can't, we don't want to reduce our awareness raising activities because you can create an ombudsman, but 2 people know about it. Can people access it? So we don't want to reduce that. So we're likely to still see that traffic.
Is there a risk of duplication, or even worse probably, some people falling literally through the cracks between the two.
I think there's an absolute risk around people falling through the gaps, but let's be really clear. The Cabinet Office has produced guidance that's been around for many years and was revalidated last year by the Cabinet Office on the creation of redress schemes. And it is explicit in that guidance, this is guidance for departments, it's explicit in that guidance that to avoid unintended consequences, you should build on existing redress services. And we are a redress scheme for landlord and tenants. That we are the only redress scheme for landlord and tenants. And you don't want a two-tier system for exactly the reasons that the Cabinet Office produced that guidance. And that's exactly why you've seen a natural evolution of other ombudsman schemes, whether it's the local government and social care ombudsman doing private as well as publicly funded social care, or the parliamentary ombudsman doing private as well as public health, or the financial ombudsman services does a whole gamut of stuff. That's exactly the route to go to avoid those unintended consequences.
So what happens, for example, on housing associations that rent out private accommodation? Where do people go then? Do they come to you? Do they go to the Ombudsman? What happens?
Well, there's a clause in the bill which I think is puzzling, which suggests that if you're a housing association,
I asked the question, actually.
those homes should be part of a different redress scheme, should be part of the private rented redress scheme. It is inconceivable that someone renting from a housing association won't think of coming to a housing ombudsman. It is wholly unproductive for us to shut the door on them when they bring their complaint. So you don't want this two-tier system, but also, and I think for me this is absolutely essential, I mean, not only have we got the expertise, I would say, around the Landlord and Tenant Act, which is distinctly different to agent redress or something like that. It's around the conduct, the conditions and repairs. You know, the Landlord and Tenant Act is clear that those are things which cannot be outsourced to a third party. Those are things the landlord has to deal with. So those are things which we already deal with, and it's a natural evolution, therefore, for us to continue to do it. Managing probably what would be quite a significant volume of inquiries from people, from residents, is going to be a feature for whoever does that. Again, that's something which we have the systems and the know-how to do, but also we can get ahead of, as I say, this big bang moment where there's a real risk that everything's waiting for all the pieces to fall into place, and that's probably quite destabilising for the market, and actually use our voluntary jurisdiction to get ahead of that and smooth out and provide some certainty.
Okay. Ben, what's the impact on private landlords who've voluntarily joined the Ombudsman scheme of this new setup?
Well, I don't know that there are many private landlords that are readily volunteering, to be honest with you. I see a lot of benefit, Bob, in being able to resolve low-level disputes. At the end of the day, this is probably long overdue, and I think it will be good in the consumer's interest and in the landlord's interest to be able to resolve these things. But I think my overriding point is there's a lot of stuff in this bill that needs to be delivered upon, right? And we probably need to find some quick wins. And I think Richard has done a pretty good sales pitch to set his stall out, but I'll leave for others to decide. Look, we see a great deal of benefit in being able to resolve these matters. It's much like making a sausage. I don't mind what goes in it as long as what comes out the other end is of decent quality, then that's fine. And that means in ombudsman circles, low cost, no big bureaucracy, quick time frames. That's what landlords and tenants need.
Okay. Tarun, what are the challenges for private renters in this scheme now, in this proposed scheme?
In the proposed scheme for the Ombudsman?
Yes.
I think Richard would probably be able to speak to that better than myself. So I think a lot of it will depend on how the Ombudsman, when it is set up, how it functions in.
But clearly, you know, one of the purposes behind this is to give tenants the opportunity to go to an independent organisation to resolve the problems that they're facing with their landlords. So surely there must be, there either be a very positive impact by having someone look at this, or alternatively, if things go wrong, you know, and they get denied or they go to the wrong ombudsman, things could get delayed.
Yeah, absolutely. No, of course, we support wholeheartedly the idea of an ombudsman for the private rented sector. I think what I was saying was that the devil, will really be in the detail. We've seen, obviously, in the social sector, the improvements that the Ombudsman Service has made to kind of its resolution times and things like that. There are still obviously challenges, sometimes to do with, the resourcing, the funding for the Ombudsman Service. And there will always be challenges, I think, for tenants in getting the best resolution where there is a power imbalance between landlord and tenant in many situations. I think also a lot of what Richard was saying does chime. It's really difficult surprisingly difficult sometimes for renters to understand who their landlord is, who the responsible person is, whether they are a private landlord, a social landlord, and those sorts of things. So it is really, really important that the system is clear, easy to understand, easy to use, and accessible. And again, I know the Ombudsman Service has done a lot of work on accessibility, but those are the really important things for renters. At the instant that they feel they need the support from either an ombudsman, an advice service, or a legal service, that part of the system needs to be really clear and easy to use for renters. There's a world in which there's 100 different setups behind that, but your kind of access through the front door is not clear.
One of the things that a lot of people are concerned about at the moment is if you're a renter and you complain, there's the risk of retaliatory eviction. Clearly, that's one of the issues that's addressed in the bill. Is that strong enough in the bill to prevent that happening if someone complains to the Ombudsman?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to what I was saying about the eviction grounds and their strengths. I think the two clearest areas of where there are potential weaknesses that we need to be absolutely sure, that those grounds are tight are the landlord need grounds, or, the new no-fault grounds, if you will. So a landlord wants to sell, a landlord wants to move in or move their family member in. I think there needs to be really robust evidence bar in those grounds, and we'll be campaigning as the bill goes through for clarity in the bill on that. We understand that there might be guidance, but we really do want the government to set out in legislation what it thinks the types of activities or things that landlords should have done to be able to prove their intention to sell the home or to move back in. I think also the landlord moving in ground or moving a family member in, it's difficult to imagine what really robust ground evidence looks like in primary legislation. So we need to see proper disincentives to the misuse of those grounds. One really key area there is the no reletting period. So the bill currently contains a clause that landlords can't relet the property after 3 months of using one of the landlord need grounds. And we think there's weaknesses there. First of all, we think that it should be 12 months long, not 3 months long, to act as a proper disincentive to abuse of those grounds. We think it should apply to all evictions. Currently, it only applies where tenants voluntarily vacate their property, not where the court has ordered possession. We believe the no reletting period should apply to all instances where a landlord need eviction, possession notice, has led to someone vacating the property. And then we think there should be something in there for tenants. At the moment, there's no route to any compensation for tenants where the landlord has misused one of the landlord need grounds or broken the no reletting period. And that's really important. We don't see that in the setup of the bill there's very strong incentives or reason for local authorities to put a lot of time and energy into the enforcement of the no reletting period. And actually, we might be quite reliant on tenants to do that, particularly in circumstances where they are, and I know it doesn't sound ideal, but particularly in circumstances where they've left voluntarily after receiving a possession notice. They and the landlord are almost the only people that know that an eviction has taken place. So enforcing the no reletting period seems to be quite reliant on them. So we think there should be something in the bill like rent repayment orders where landlords have abused or broken the no reletting period to give some incentive
I think we're broadening out from the work of the Ombudsman to other questions. So yeah. I'll draw a halt there because I think colleagues will want to ask one or two other questions.
Right. Look at issues to do with landlords. Ben.
Thank you, Clive. So I'll start with you, Ben. What a...
Sorry, I think Ian wants to come and supplementary.
Just a real quick one, sorry,
Right.
Ben, thanks, just to Richard. In light of what Ben just said about the low take-up from the private renter sector for the voluntary ombudsman, shouldn't we looking at making it mandatory? You talked about the two-tier system. Well, that feels like a two-tier system to me.
You're right. That's what we have now, and that needs correcting. But it needs correcting in in a way which avoids all the unintended consequences of people then not knowing or not being able to access. I think if you end up with different redress schemes, which is why across redress in so many different sectors, that's not what happens, and that's what the government's own guidance says should not happen. If you end up with that, you both impair access at one end, but also impact at the other, because the more fragmented the jurisdictions of an ombudsman are, then the more hamstrung they are in the decisions that they make. And I think one of the things which I'm really struck by is obviously the population that we have in private rent includes lots of vulnerable people, lots of people who will be experiencing issues with their property condition. I absolutely accept Ben's point that there are many decent landlords, but there's also 23% of homes which are non-decent in this sector. And at the moment, they don't have an effective route outside the courts to redress that if the landlord is not responsive to them. And I think, so 16% of our members under our mandatory membership have fewer than 10 homes. 18% of private landlords have more than 5 homes. There are HMOs that have to be licensed. So I think already you can see pockets of the private rented sector where right now, working with with NRLA and with others, we could start to onboard landlords, bring them into our jurisdiction, provide independent and impartial and cost-effective and timely redress, rather than wait for this big bang moment from the bill. Where there's a real risk that suddenly there'll be a lot of volatility because people will suddenly be racing to go to which service, have I gone to the right place, and so on. I think there's crucial time now that could be spent on planning and getting the pieces in place. And I would love to work with Ben's organisation. I would love to work with landlords who are HMOs, who are meant to be licensed. I'd love to work with those larger private landlords because I think there's real benefits to them as well as to their residents.
Okay, thanks. Ben, over to you now.
Thank you, Clive. So, Ben, what are the main concerns landlords have around the ending of fixed-term tenancies in the private rented sector?
Yeah, well, I think there's two principal concerns, Ben. Firstly is the fact that somebody would be able to move in, give 2 months' notice, and then leave pretty much straight away. What we don't want to do is to turn the PRS into sort of Airbnb light. So we do need to caution against that. I get the average tenancy length is over 4 years, and I know we're in the middle of a housing supply crisis, but even so, because the knock-on effect for small landlords is significant. Those tenancy set-up costs will hurt small landlords if you get a lot of churn. The other area that it affects or will affect adversely is the student sector, and this is something I think that the committee has made in its last report references to, that if you have in open-ended indefinite tenancies for the student market, you not only knock tenants' abilities to be able to find properties when they need them, but you also knock landlords' ability to be able to provide properties when those tenants need them. And I can't honestly see what sort of problem it's trying to resolve, particularly given the admissions by government that the purpose-built student accommodation sector is kind of out on its own, retaining the fixed term and able to get possession when they need it. This isn't about Section 21 via the back door. This is about not breaking something that isn't broken yet, frankly. And so, what we would like to see on these two counts, because we don't want to, we want people to stay in their homes for a long period of time, and for the student sector, we want to make sure that sector works for both the landlord and the tenant. So we would like to mirror the sort of moratorium period that has been suggested for landlords. So if you want to move back in or you wish to sell your house, you can't give notice within the first 6 months of the tenancy. And we say that in order to safeguard against those concerns, the same should be afforded to landlords so that tenants can't give notice within the first 6 months. And what that would do is go some way to helping with the student conundrum, but also the wider concerns that, you know, we do want people to bring their properties to the private rented sector, and we don't want to create another Airbnb. And given the concession that has been made there, we think that aligning those timeframes would work very well, with the exception if a tenant moved into the property and it was substandard, horrible condition, didn't meet safety standards, etc. Obviously, we wouldn't, there'd be no notice effectively. This is not about lowering standards. It's about striking the balance, if I coin a phrase, to make things work for both tenants and responsible landlords.
Thank you. That's quite comprehensive, and I'll come back to you in a second about the using the courts and so on, not specifically about Section 21, but we'll probably get there. But actually, I'm quite interested, Tarun, in what you think about those points that Ben raised, both in a sort of a holistic point of view, but from shelters point of view, homelessness charity, and then specifically around the student accommodation point.
Yeah, sure. So I think we want to express concerns about what those measures would look like and how they would be designed, I think. So one of the big, really significant benefits of the ending of fixed term tenancies is the ability for renters, when they do move into a property that isn't as expected, isn't up to standard, or their circumstances change, they are able to give notice and move out those homes. Our concern would be in designing that moratorium period that Ben was talking about. Can the legislation account for those various different circumstances in which it would be legitimate, we think, for a tenant to be able to serve notice and leave? So that would be a big concern of ours with a tenant moratorium period, is that it would recreate some of the challenges that renters face in their fixed terms. When it comes to students, I think, again, similarly, we'd be concerned about how you would design that legislation to capture the people that maybe Ben is talking about, but not exclude the various different people who, technically are students, but have very different living circumstances to who you might imagine would need that kind of yearly cycle. Students are a really, really diverse group of people. Many students have children, many students live with their families still, many students live with people who have caring needs and they have caring responsibilities towards them. Those people need the benefits of these reforms. They need the benefits of the end of fixed term tenancies and the end of Section 21 just as much as any other renters. So we'd be really concerned that any legislation or new eviction ground or whatever it is to kind of keep tenants in that yearly cycle and enable landlords to keep in that yearly cycle if they're predominantly letting out to students, that wouldn't impact those other renters who are students but live in different living circumstances adversely.
This is for students not living in purpose-built student accommodation.
Students not living in purpose-built accommodation. So I believe what Ben is talking about, kind of, the wider market. But, there are landlords that predominantly let to students. And, we just want to warn that, any eviction ground, the design of it, it's really hard for us to see how it could be designed in a way that doesn't adversely impact those renters that are students but have that different living circumstances to what maybe we imagine when we hear students.
I'll show you the detail after.
Of course, there's the wider issue, of course, of supply of student housing, where if good landlords are feeling pushed out of the market, there's obviously less supply there as well. Thanks, Tarun. Ben, I'll come back to you just very briefly, because you raised the issue of Section 21 and courts and so on. How easy is it currently for landlords to use the courts when they're seeking to evict tenants who have they've got themselves in rent arrears or they're practising antisocial behaviour?
Well, it's very painful. I mean, one of the advantages, dare I say, of Section 21 is that you are able to deal with antisocial behaviour and rent arrears in a far more pragmatic way, without kind of pointing the finger, in a way that means people can go on to be rehoused. And I guess what we are looking for, we see lots of grounds that have been set out that seek to not replicate the workings of Section 21, but obviously carve out some of the issues. I don't buy the argument that Section 21 is the biggest cause of homelessness, because in 2 years' time, I'll tell you what, it'd be Section 8. We have to have a bit more of a sensible debate about some of this stuff. Around a third of repossessions are for antisocial behaviour, and we need to dial back as to what the reason is, because although landlords don't need to provide a reason, there invariably is one. It could be that they're selling, it could be that there's bad behaviour, it could be that there is rent arrears, and what we don't want to do is to legitimise rent dodgers and bad behaviour. We want to make sure that landlords are able to have the tools at their disposal to be able to deal with this effectively. And this is really important, because whilst we see the grounds and the timeframes and a mix of mandatory and discretionary grounds, the $64 million question is the system that's underpinning it. And of course, we have no clarity around what court reform looks like. I was at a meeting with some very senior judiciary last week, and the bad news is neither do they. We all want to see end-to-end digitalisation. We all want to see tenants get advice much earlier in the process. This is a two-way street. But at the moment, I don't feel any great sense of confidence that those that are suffering at the hands of antisocial behaviour are going to get their justice in a timely way. I really, really don't. And that's borne out by the fact that the MOJ can't even procure stab-proof vests very quickly. Now, if you can't procure stab-proof vests, I don't really hold a lot of hope in getting a whole new WYSI IT system up and running in the next few months. Call me a cynic. I'm normally a glass half full kind of guy, but I don't see it. And obviously the committee themselves have recommended a housing court, and all I'm saying is, actually, I love the idea of a housing court, but I'd rather we adopt some of the things that work on Section 21 so the most serious cases can be fast-tracked. I don't think that's an unreasonable request.
Priorities and resources.
Indeed, absolutely.
Yeah. Tarun, this one sounds right up your street as well.
I think we've always said we'd agree that the courts do need reform. It needs to work better, but for both landlords and tenants. On the tenant side, obviously, as Ben said, access to early legal advice. Legal aid has been absolutely decimated in recent decades, and we believe that with early legal advice, a lot of the cases that we see, our lawyers see in court, wouldn't end up in court as well. And that's really important to say that, there are measures that can take the pressure off the courts in that sense, and they don't necessarily need to be legislative ones that are done via the Renters Reform Bill. I would also say that, the scrutiny of the Renters Reform Bill and its implementation will be a lot longer than a few months. I know, obviously, people here want to see the courts reformed and see that they're working, but I think it's really important to say that, it's been nearly 2 months already since the first reading. We're not second reading yet. There's an implementation timeline of 6 months and then another year on the tenancy reform. So it is going to take a while to see these reforms come in, and there's a lot that the government can do to improve the court processes in parallel, and we would definitely support that. What we don't support is the weakening of eviction grounds, the shortening of notice periods as a response to issues with the courts that can be resolved in other ways, because there are concerns we have concerns that there are unintended consequences of those. I think it's really important to say as well that, Section 21 evictions, we do recognise that many landlords are using Section 21 evictions for legitimate reasons, and as Ben said, there will always be a reason. But we ran some research this year, and it found that private renters who'd complained to their landlord, letting agent or local authority were 2.5 times more likely to have received an eviction notice than those who hadn't complained in that research. So it just shows that there does exist uses of Section 21 evictions that absolutely aren't legitimate, and it doesn't take many of those instances for renters to be fearful of complaining and making reasonable requests of their landlords. Furthermore, sorry, I know this is a long answer, but furthermore, landlords may be using Section 21 evictions where there are arrears or where they deem there to be antisocial behaviour. But what we don't know within that is whether, in those instances, the arrears levels are at the levels that the eviction ground, Section 8 grounds, would set out. So a landlord may be using Section 21 notice to evict for arrears, but they could be small amounts of arrears. We don't know that, and that's part of the problem with Section 21, is we can't disentangle legitimate evictions from illegitimate evictions. So that's one of the big benefits of moving to Section 8, is having those grounds really clearly set out. Tenants should understand them, landlords should understand them, and they should be fair, and eviction should be proportionate in those instances, and I think that's really important.
I think that's probably why the bill in its current form is so complex, but the complexity is going to make it very hard to adhere to. Ben, what support should the government be giving to landlords to make them be able to comply with their responsibilities under the new bill?
Yeah, I just want to quickly come back on that point, if I may, and then I'll answer that one. But I wanted to say, this is quite important, the government has published its impact assessment on the bill, but it doesn't include an impact assessment on the measures it will have on court workload, which I think is telling, frankly. Because I think they've not considered this. And the second thing is that in all of the meetings I've had with Michael Gove and others, I'm told that timing-wise, some of this stuff is not going to come forward until Section 21 Section 21 won't be abolished until the court systems are ready. So there's a massive question mark over the timing of some of this stuff. And it's worth me pointing out, I think, for the record, that last English Housing Survey said that only in 6% of cases did a landlord ask their tenant to move on. And so we just have to be very careful that we don't, use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I think in terms of what the government can do to help landlords, I think there's a massive opportunity with the portal. Frankly, this is, as I say, I look through things with a slightly more positive light. As a responsible landlord, and 80% meet the decent home standard, or 79% properties meet the decent home standard, give landlords an opportunity to prove that they are a good landlord. We're not all Rackmans. This is actually a tiny, tiny percentage of what's out there. And I think Michael Gove acknowledged it as recently as last week in the NRLA's own publication, multi-award-winning property magazine, to say that he needs small landlords. And that's right. 94% of properties are owned by an individual, and just under half have one or two. We kick private landlords at their peril, and what we must do is give those responsible and decent people an opportunity to prove that their properties are in good condition, and at the same time give renters the information that they need, that they can make an informed decision. By all means, go after the bad ones, but do that in a very, very targeted way. And I think that's where the property portal will not only help landlords, not only help renters, but also help local authorities highlight who those bad landlords are. And that's why I think the quid pro quo for some of this stuff is the abolition of local selective and discretionary licensing, because two reasons. One, if the property portal isn't to that level, you've got a problem. And secondly, if you do leave a dual system, you not only have duplication, but it comes back to what we've always suggested licensing is about, and that's funding local authorities to the detriment of standards. We are about high standards. Let landlords prove it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a couple of points before just come on to the question for Ian. On that, Ben, selective licence is also about inspections, isn't it? It allows local authorities more powers to go in and inspect.
Well, I haven't had an inspection at one of my properties for years.
That can be arranged.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, anytime. I practice what I preach, Clive.
That is a difference.
Yes, there is a difference there, I guess. But this is about, if we look at selective licensing, then what we have is local authorities saying, right, well, we're going to have it for right the way across Liverpool, for example. And really, the only grounds for some element of selective licensing should be limited to a particularly problematic street. You don't need borough-wide licensing.
Perhaps they've got wider problems in Liverpool, but I'm sure he'll come on to that in a minute. Just, Tarun, about student housing. I understand the concerns that somehow students are going to be discriminated against if you don't have open-ended tenancies for them. But isn't the other problem that come September, students actually want to have a place in which they can go for their academic year? And last September, there were some real horror stories around, I think, a number of universities. I mean, Manchester was one, where students were being advised to go to Liverpool. Now, I'm sure Liverpool's a very nice place to go to, but it's rather a long way to go to lectures if you live in Liverpool and have to go to Manchester. Isn't that a problem that really has to be addressed in some form? It isn't like any other form of housing, but just making the caveat that students, I think, have got concerned that being exempt from having open-ended tenancies also exempts from every other form, every other one of the reforms in the legislation. It doesn't. If you have a fixed-term tenancy, you're still going to have the same rights to the same standards and the same redress as every other tenant. Isn't that something we've got to find a way forward, haven't we?
Yeah, I think I understand the point. I think what I wanted to do was point out some of the potential pitfalls in any approach to retain that sort of fixed-term system. I understand that it's retaining aspects of it. It's not the whole thing. But yeah, I think it's just really, really important to say and really explain that students aren't this homogenous group who rent year on year and move out each year, and there's a real risk in retaining fixed term tenancies or creating a new eviction ground that students sometimes from marginalised communities, sometimes low income because they're still studying, will be put at risk by any move to kind of retain fixed term tenancies for them. I think on the supply angle as well, there's a risk and a concern, and obviously we don't know what the impacts of it would be, but creating or retaining fixed term tenancies or a new eviction ground for the purposes of students could create perverse incentives in markets where it's more attractive and more desirable to rent in the student market sector, whatever we want to call it, and that takes homes out of the family part of the market, and that could create imbalances in different ways and create new problems, which we then need to address in different ways.
Want to come back to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out that the student HMO market is an incredibly regulated market in terms of licensing and in terms of standards. And you're right to point out the supply challenges within this sector already. But if you add to that the fact that you can't just switch tenure, landlords are not going to be able to say, oh, well, I've not been able to find a tenant, I'm going to go and find a family. That then wipes out the status of the property, and that's why it's really, really important that the student market is singled out for protecting that element. This isn't about getting rid of all of the other things around the periphery. That's fine. It's about, as I said at the outset, it's about not causing the next problem and ring fencing that fixed term in some way that keeps the cyclical element is so important.
Okay, let's move on to...
Can I just ask?
Yes.
The evidence from Scotland on students suggests, because they've done this already, suggests that there's less accommodation for students and the prices of rents are going up for students. Have you got evidence of that from your from the National Landlords Association?
Well, I think from what we see at the moment, rents are generally increasing.
They're generally going up anyway.
Across the board.
But I'm specifically looking at student accommodation because that's a clear concern in the bill.
Yeah, I mean, in general terms, Bob, obviously the less you're going to have of something, the more it's going to cost, fact. But I'll write to you afterwards, if that's okay, with some details on student statistics, if we have them.
Okay, very well.
Ian.
Yeah, thanks, yeah. I can't leave without Ben saying landlord licensing was hugely successful in Liverpool, Ben. Had a real impact in Liverpool on driving up standards, so I couldn't disagree with you more what you've just said there. Then we can have that discussion offline, I'm sure. Tarun, I want to touch on a couple of things regarding Section 21. So why have groups such as Citizens Advice described that the provisions of the Renters Reform Bill as a potential backdoor to no false evictions?
So I think this is what I was talking about earlier with the loopholes that potentially exist in the bill.
You just go into them for us, yeah?
Go into them in detail, yeah, sure. So I spoke earlier a bit about the landlord need grounds, so potential weaknesses in the design of those. I think I started to go into it earlier. The no reletting period is a big concern of ours. At the moment, it's only 3 months that a landlord won't be able to put the home back up on the market after using a landlord need ground. We don't think that that's a strong enough disincentive to misusing those grounds, particularly when you consider that it might be quite difficult to design robust evidential requirements for the landlord moving in ground. It's really difficult to imagine what that would look like, but obviously we want the government to try their best, but it's hard to imagine how the court could be absolutely sure that a landlord is moving in or moving their family member in and not evicting for alternate reasons. So we think there needs to be those strong disincentives via the no reletting period. So a 12-month no reletting period is what we're recommending. Rent repayment orders as a route for tenants to be able to seek compensation and seek redress where they believe that they were wrongfully evicted and they've seen either the property back up on the market or they believe that the ground was used wrongly. Some incentive for tenants to bring the cases to the local authority, because at the moment the way that it's designed, in many instances it's only going to be the tenant and the landlord that know that an eviction has taken place under the landlord need grounds, and so we think there should be some incentive in there for tenants to be able to bring those cases. At the moment it's just civil penalty notices up to 30k for local authorities, but in speaking to some local authorities it's not clear that they're going to be pursuing that regularly and looking to kind of build funds via CPNs, though we think it's a good measure in the bill and should be kept in there. So yeah, improvements to the no reletting period. We think information on the property portal could help with that as well. We haven't thought about exactly the detail of this, but evictions information or tenancy information on the property portal could help local authorities better understand whether evictions had taken place and whether the reletting period had been broken. So that's another measure that might improve.
How likely is it that the new possession grounds that you're talking about would result in an increase in evictions of, say, vulnerable groups in the private rented sector? And has it solved the imbalance of power, what we were talking about before? Because there is an imbalance of power, isn't it, between tenant and landlord? We know that with Section 21. Does this help to resolve that, or are we just back to where we were with Section 21? We celebrate to get rid of that, but are we back in the same position with Section 8?
I think we'd be a bit more positive than that. I think the scrapping of Section 21 as the cornerstone of this bill is really, really important, and we have in the first publication of the bill a good foundation, but there definitely needs to be some tightening up of the evictions grounds, and we think that that's very possible, including some of those disincentives to misusing those grounds. So no, I wouldn't say that it's entirely recreating the old system, but there is a real risk there that where there is one or two weaknesses in the Section 8 grounds that
they'll be found out and they'll be utilised by bad landlords.
And be utilised by those landlords that do seek to abuse the grounds. And it doesn't take many instances of that for renters to feel fearful of making complaints, challenging rent increases. So that's the other impact. It's not just people receiving evictions, but it is concerns about or fear of eviction, preventing people from asserting their rights. So yeah, those are kind of the two main areas where we think
could there like a mandatory sign up for the Ombudsman assistant to help that? Is that something which we could utilise, which potentially won't get utilised? Thinking about people who are fearful of challenging.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for the Ombudsman in this. There's clearly a role for the Ombudsman in supporting tenants to make complaints and things like that. But I think there is every chance that the Ombudsman's work is undermined by structural deficiencies in the bill. So if there are those legal routes to evicting tenants legitimately, but for alternate reasons, that could undermine the Ombudsman's ability to get redress for tenants and ensure that tenants are able to assert their rights, because there is still that threat of an unfair eviction hanging over the rent.
Just going to touch on what support would a tenant need to help them about rent rises, make informed decisions around whether a rent increase is above market value, because at the moment my inbox is just full of people who've been turfed out because they can't afford to pay the rent, and then rises have happened. So what would you envisage from Shelter's perspective?
Yeah, so I think one measure that could help with understanding the rental market and understanding whether your rent increase is unfair is I think there's an opportunity in the portal there. We understand at the moment the portal is designed to include safety, property information, but there could also be rent data on the property portal as a publicly available data source that could be something that's useful to tenants in understanding whether their rent is a reasonable increase. I think one thing that we're really disappointed not to see in the bill is the promise that was in the white paper to prevent tribunals, so if a tenant wants to challenge a rent increase at tribunal, from determining a higher rent than the landlord has proposed in the first place. As an advice organisation, we are not going to be able to advise tenants that they can go to tribunal and there is no risk of their rent increasing even further with that. So it's really important that tenants feel confident and able to go to tribunal.
Just looking at the situation where we are now, just to finish, in London, I think it's 60% potentially of incomes getting utilised on rent. I think it's 40% across the country. It's catastrophic on so many levels. What's your thoughts on a rent cap elements coming in? Mayor of London's touched on it. There's other places that are looking at it. Is that something which potentially could be utilised to try and cool down the market and keep people in homes?
I think, first of all, the kind of key solutions in addressing affordability in the sector for us are supply of social housing, which would, not only provide more affordable accommodation, but also take pressure off the private rented sector.
Yeah, but that's in a perfect world. That's where we are now.
And so where we are now, something that the government can immediately do is uprate local housing allowance. It's frozen at the moment and falling woefully behind private rents, particularly in London. And at the moment, because designing a rent cap policy, working through the renters reform bill, scrutinising it, that will take much longer than uprating welfare and local housing allowance. Moving to the future, we think bringing in those measures that the government promised on the tribunal to support renters to feel comfortable in challenging unfair rent increases and making sure that the data is there, it's good enough for renters to challenge those unfair rent increases and they have the security to do so.
Richard or Ben, you want to comment on anything that's been...
Yeah, if I can please, in order. So in terms of those two grounds, the no fault ground, this isn't roulette. It gets tested in court. It goes before a judge. A judge will need to be satisfied that the landlord is telling the truth about selling the property. And last time I checked, if you lied in court, it was perjury. So I'd say that was a pretty strong disincentive. I don't know what my friend from Shelter really wants to see, whether it's waterboarding or public flogging, but a financial penalty of 30k if you relet sounds to me to be a lot of money. And I think we have to look through the lens of why landlords are selling, and the confidence levels in the sector are where we should start, rather than having punishing 12 months waits and lots of extended notice periods that actually do your clients a great disservice. As far as the court process is concerned, it's worth pointing out, I think, that 15% of respondents' tenants reply. But it is right to make sure that those people have the help that they need if it comes to it. And in terms of things that can be done now, I would agree with Lisa Nandy and Julie James when they rule out any form of rent control or caps, and would much rather focus on something we can agree on, local housing allowance being unfrozen to help the most vulnerable, but also looking at landlords' costs as well and things that are causing them to exit the market. And that includes punishing tax changes, meaning you pay tax on your revenue, not your profit. And just in terms of the tribunal challenge, what you can't do, it is right that they've amended this in the bill, actually. You can't clip the judiciary's wings. The judiciary is totally independent. If they feel it's gone up, down, or the rent stayed the same, then that's what one has to go with. This isn't about trying to preempt what the outcome is going to be. It's an independent process, and the judiciary will decide. Now, I think the first tier tribunal does need extra resources to be able to cope with this, But the best way of bringing rents down is to look at the cost base and increase supply, and increasing social housing, but also the role that the private rented sector has in providing decent homes.
Yes, just a quick question to Ben. The evidence suggests that the number of landlords leaving the market is increasing. The number of properties, therefore, coming out of the PRS is therefore increasing. The number of properties being sold to owner-occupiers is not changing. The Section 21 notices we hear are increasing as a result of the publication of the bill. Now that suggests to me that a lot of landlords are saying, to hell with this, I'm going to go to the Airbnb market where I can charge a very large rent, there's virtually no regulation, and I don't have any problem getting rid of the tenants if I don't like them.
Yeah, well,
do you have evidence of that from your members?
Well, certainly the sentiment index that we have been running that predates the NRLA, but for a good 15 years, is showing landlord confidence at an all-time low. What I would say to you is, I mean, we know that the tax environment for furnished holiday lettings is the same as it was in the PRS until government decided to change it. And that essentially means you can offset your full finance costs like you can do anywhere else, unless you're an individual in the private rented sector. The mood music from landlords, and I was at a show last week, is that they are exiting the sector, or certainly selling off some of their properties. But what I would point to, because we've had this discussion before, is other sources, which is simply saying that supply and demand are massively out of kilter. So Zoopla's most recent data shows that demand for private rented housing is up 51% compared to the 5-year average. Rightmove notes that the number of properties is down by 46% compared with the pre-pandemic in 2019, whilst the number of people inquiring is 173% higher. Whichever way you look, there's a lead time on landlords exiting the sector, right? So what landlords say and what they do takes some time to bear out. What we know is that we have rents the highest on record, and we have all credible sources, including the Bank of England, including the government itself, saying that we have a demand and supply imbalance. And that is the thing that we should be focusing on.
Tarun, can I just ask you, sorry, this is the last thing I do want to ask for. Given your suggestion that there should be a 12 months moratorium on evicting tenants if you're going to either move your family in or sell the property before you can re-let, given we've got a problem of literally street homelessness is going up, would we rather have properties empty for 12 months and unused, untenanted, rather than have a position whereby landlords could actually move tenants in? It doesn't seem very logical to me.
I see what you're saying, but I think what we want to see is, proper disincentives. If you're talking about the no reletting period following the use of a landlord need eviction ground, is disincentives to the misuse of those grounds. I'll just come back to what Ben said earlier about perjury in court. We know that many tenants, or most tenants, leave once they've received an eviction notice before a court date. That's what you are likely to do if the landlord served it.
Because that would be very helpful for us to, as an organisation. Maybe.
I'll have a look. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll write to the committee with the data that we do have.
Well, that would be very helpful because it just helps inform us of what the position is overall.
Okay. And Richard, I think you were going to come into that follow-up.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up briefly on your question about an ombudsman. I completely recognise the point that Tarun's made around Section 21 being a barrier for people potentially raising complaints. But two brief observations. The first is that the relationship between an ombudsman and the courts process will be absolutely critical to get clarity on jurisdictions. At the moment, we deal with tenancy issues, we deal with arrears issues as well. There's a distinct role for us and there's a distinct role for the courts, and it's being absolutely clear on that so that the landlord and the consumer has an understanding of the role. I think a clear example of that would be if you move to periodic tenancies, then the role for the pre-action protocol on housing disrepair will become potentially more apparent, and we've done a tremendous amount of work with our bodies in our jurisdiction to get clarity on claims versus complaints so they don't get muddled up. And just as a final word, we have a case which we're actually going to publish very soon, probably this week, where a landlord, social landlord, issued a Section 21 notice, and it involved a resident in a wheelchair who had mobility issues in her home because of repair issues, condition issues. And again, I think it was absolutely clear that notice turned out to be invalid, but there was still a huge amount that we were able to do to provide redress for that individual for the property condition issues that they experienced, and indeed the discrimination, I would say, that they experienced. And I think, again, it's not a kind of zero sum between the courts and the Ombudsman. It's about weaving those together effectively. And the best way to do that is to build on the existing landlord-tenant scheme that we have in this country, rather than creating multiple versions of it.
Tarun, Shelter currently take up cases on behalf of tenants in the social housing sector who are threatened with eviction for antisocial behaviour. As an organisation which, you know, is a charitable organisation, so you represent people free of charge, do you think you have a wider responsibility to the community in which those tenants live? Because often it's other tenants who are bearing the brunt of that antisocial behaviour, yet you're often there fighting for the one who's causing it and the ones who experience it.
Well, I would just add that we do also support tenants on the other side of the relationship, experiencing antisocial behaviour or other forms of behaviour that is disturbing or upsetting to them on the other side, so those people experiencing it too. So we don't just support those who are threatened with eviction. What I would say is that, the eviction grounds as they are, those do exist. Landlords will be able to regain possession of their homes for antisocial behaviour. What we're concerned about, and this isn't to prevent all evictions for antisocial behaviour, what we're concerned about is in response to things like court delays and court complexity and things like that, that the eviction grounds are being weakened to such a level so as to enable unfair evictions of people for antisocial behaviour. So we don't know what the impact of the change to ground 14 is going to be. So it's a wording change from, likely to cause nuisance or annoyance to capable of causing nuisance or annoyance. Yeah. We understand there's guidance to come. What we really, really want to warn against is setting that evidence bar so low so as to bring in people who might be wrongfully accused of antisocial behaviour. We're part of the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, who have written, really helpful response to the first reading of the bill. We know that accusations of antisocial behaviour often misinterpreted domestic abuse and violence situations, often associated with mental health and neurodiverse conditions. What we want to make sure is that reforms to the eviction grounds don't unduly impact those already marginalised renters who, when faced with an eviction, will struggle more than others to find a home in the rented sector because they're more likely to be claiming benefits and more likely to be face discrimination in the sector. Just one thing before is the reduction of notice periods to 0 weeks is a big concern for us on the antisocial behaviour grounds. We understand, again, it's in response to court delays and things like that, but 0 weeks, and this may be in an ideal world, but that's how we should be designing the eviction grounds themselves. 0 weeks is not enough time for those tenants, with those already existing marginalisations, to be able to receive early legal advice and to be able to defend unfair evictions on antisocial behaviour. That's really, really important because those defences, often along the lines of the Equality Act, are complicated. They would be difficult for an individual to undertake themselves, obviously. So 0 weeks is a big concern for us in tenants accessing legal support.
Right. Very briefly, Ben.
Very briefly.
Very briefly.
The court system must be on the side of the victims, not the perpetrators. Short notice period, quick processes. We can't focus on the 1% of the 1% of the 1%.
I think the domestic abuse ones, one we've asked the Minister to look at anyway, but at some point, we can't carry this conversation much longer, but I'd like to talk to you about, I just don't see Shelter acting on behalf of the victims in these cases in my own experience, and I think it's a real concern about your reputational damage to you as an organisation, but maybe we can have a conversation elsewhere about that. Okay. Right. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon and giving evidence to us on what is a very important reform, but still one with a lot of issues that need to be addressed. Thank you. And we move on to the Minister.
Yeah.
Two lads there.
Yeah.
Got an order.
Yes, please.
What's this debate?
I have.
About 2 hours, I think.
Right, yeah.
Thank you so much. Oh, very warm seat.
Yes, please do. Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Looking great.
It's any hour.
It's not time limited.
Any hour.
Yeah.
I always let people down.
Right, moving on to our second panel. Warm welcome to the Minister of State for Housing and Planning. You're very welcome again, Minister, coming to see us. Do you want to introduce your officials?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and it's great to be here. This is Guy Horsington, and this is Stephanie Kvam, and I wonder if perhaps they could actually update the committee on their precise job titles.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Guy Horsington. I'm the Deputy Director in the Department for Levelling Up, working on the Renters Reform Bill, but particularly on tenancy and redress reform.
And I'm Stephanie Kvam. I'm the Deputy Director that leads on standards, enforcement and financial protections in the department.
Okay, thank you for coming this afternoon with the Minister. Minister, I suppose the obvious question, and apologies for keeping you for a few minutes,
All right.
but you've actually kept us for several months waiting for a response to the report that we did back in February, and we've had a number of apologies and explanations about why we haven't had a response to the recommendations we made in our report, given they're directly relevant to the bill which you've now produced. Is it possible to update us on where that's up to?
Yes, and that's a very fair challenge, Chair, and thank you, obviously, for giving me the chance to apologise once again for the additional delay, which is regrettable, but not due to anything other than the need to discuss these matters across government. I hope that we did update you with a courtesy letter just to let you know that we needed a bit more time to consider your very helpful suggestions. I hope you've received that. Perhaps the clerks have. But we very much hope to be able to come forward with a more fulsome response in due course.
Do you think we might get it before the recess?
I think given that the recess is 2 weeks from now, I think that's probably going to be unlikely, although I wouldn't want to rule it out. There are a number of different discussions that have to be had across government, as I'm sure you'll understand.
Well, I partly do, but given that the issues are ones that are directly relevant to the bill that the government's already produced, with it clearly government position in that bill, that's difficult probably to quite grasp why it takes so much longer to produce a response to our report.
I do appreciate the frustration, and what I can say is that obviously I'm very happy to sort of deal with individual points in that report, which I'm sure we will do during the course of the session, and I think we did discuss some of it in the previous meeting we had with your committee as well. So I think there's probably a lot we can talk about, even though we're not able to provide you with that formal, full response.
Right, well, let's try and raise some of the issues then that aren't in the bill, that we probably hope to see, and a number of organisations would have hoped to have seen. Decent home standard, which the government's indicated it wants to see for the private rental sector. An end to discrimination against potential tenants who are in receipt of housing benefits. Maybe stronger enforcement powers for councils. Are those issues that are going to be addressed in due course in the bill? If so, are they going to be in the form of amendments to the bill as it goes through?
Yes, so I want to be clear that we have committed to introducing the decent home standards. That remains our intention to do that during the course of the bill. We have consulted on it, we've looked at the responses, and you'll probably have noted, Chair, that there is a sort of holding clause in the bill as introduced, which I'm sure the committee will be familiar with. That's normally the mechanism, should we wish to pursue it, by which we would introduce amendments. I'm afraid I'm not able to give any more definitive information on that, other than to reiterate very firmly that, as I said many times, both in here and also on the floor of the House, that we are committed to introducing that decent home standard.
Right, and the issue of not banning renting to people on benefits.
Exactly that, and that's also very much at the heart of our intention, and it's something we've consulted on, we've publicly committed to do it, and we remain committed to doing that.
Right, and enforcement powers for councils?
Yes, indeed, absolutely, that as well, because you'll appreciate there's a lot in there to consider with enforcement powers of the council, so we need to make sure again that we've got all the detail precisely right when we come forward with that.
Right. Is there an idea of timing? I suppose I might ask about timing of the bill while we're at it, when we're likely to actually see it debated. Second reading in the House, no doubt. That's down to the parliamentary business manager, so you probably can't comment on that, can you?
Chair, you know better than I do that I can't, unfortunately. Although we have, of course, very constructive discussions with our colleagues in those respective departments.
Right. So just in terms of the amendments on the issues we just talked about, are they likely to come? What stage in the bill's progress are they likely to come?
I'm sorry that I can't give you any more information, and I appreciate your frustration and your very reasonable desire to have certainty. We will, of course, as soon as we are in a position to provide that, we will be making that clear to yourselves and also to Parliament.
Right. So I presume we are going to get them before so they can be considered at report stage.
Well, I mean, there's a process, obviously, that when things are brought forward by the government, then we need to allow enough time for scrutiny of those measures. And of course, if and when the bill is in report stage, that will be the time when members of Parliament will have ample opportunity to scrutinise all these measures, and I'm sure that there will be debates over them at that time.
What I'm trying to get at is they're not going to be delayed so long that they're eventually introduced in the House of Lords. So in this House, we don't get a chance to actually have a look at them.
I mean, it is certainly not our intention to introduce them in the House of Lords. What we want to do is introduce them in the Commons for the reasons that you said, because we think it's right that things are scrutinised in the Commons.
Okay, let's move on to the specific issue of the new Ombudsman, which is in the bill. Andrew.
Thank you. Welcome, Minister. So, how will the powers and the role of the proposed new Ombudsman interact with the existing redress services that are already used by private renters and landlords?
Thank you for that question. I think you've just had the existing housing ombudsman here in front of your committee, if my information is correct, and we need to get this right. So it is clearly going to be, for any ombudsman, a big task to make sure that they can satisfactorily address the complaints from the potentially up to 11 million people, though we hope they don't all have a complaint, living in the private rented sector. So we do need to do quite a bit of work to make sure that we've got the systems and the processes and, most importantly, the communication right. Clearly, in terms of the bill itself and the powers, the redress for consumers will be available as soon as royal assent is given. But I think what you're probably getting at is to ask me, like, what exactly is the Ombudsman, what form is it going to take? And that is still work that's ongoing at the moment, because we just want to get it right. Did you want to say a bit more about that, Guy?
Yeah, sure. So obviously there is a gap at the moment, and we don't have an Ombudsman service for the private rented sector. We do for social housing, and we have redress schemes which are available for letting agents and management agents. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve, which is to bring forward an Ombudsman service to provide that for the private renters that the Minister mentioned. We obviously want to make sure that in deciding who delivers the Ombudsman service, we take into account the range of factors such as how will it start, how will it serve a large group of community, how will it ensure that communications are clear. And that's the work that we want to do. And what we've done in the bill is to legislate for a process by which we can decide whether through on-paper competition or whether the Secretary of State designating an existing scheme, a variety of routes to do that. But what we want to make sure is that we get that redress provision to private renters as soon as possible once we've done that implementation work.
The government has this sort of overall strategic aim that it talks about quite a lot, about cutting down on bureaucracy, making it easier to do business, not creating unnecessary quangos. And at a tactical level, as we've just heard from the Housing Ombudsman, its own advice on redress schemes is to avoid complication and duplication, bearing in mind that ordinary people trying to get on with their lives don't have a flow chart in their back pocket showing which different organisation deals with what. So, given that this is as complicated as you've just said, and given that the numbers of people that this is potentially going to involve, I still don't think government's really got into their head just how vast and enormous this is going to be. Is it at least an option for the government to fold these new powers either into the social housing ombudsman as currently exists, or to expand out the redress schemes that letting agents have that cover a large amount of the private rented sector but don't cover at the moment those people who rent directly themselves?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I'd like to say. First is that it is absolutely our intention to reduce bureaucracy and avoid duplication. In fact, it's not only our intention, it's government policy, as you said, but more rigorously than that. It is that we are not physically allowed to, as this department, to create bodies. There's Cabinet Office guidance that covers all of this. So they are very strict about creating a new body. They will interrogate any plans to do that, and we will have to demonstrate that there is a genuine need for a new body. And likewise, we will have to demonstrate if we decide to go with an existing redress scheme, either the ones you've mentioned or the Housing Ombudsman themselves, or indeed any of them. We will have to demonstrate conversely that that particular body would be capable of doing the job that we're asking it to do, and that they have the funding, the powers, the capability, and most importantly, I think, to my mind, is the service. Can they actually provide the service? So these are things that I certainly, as a minister, am very interested in before I would direct my officials to make a final choice of how we do that. But at the same time, there's been a lot of work going on from the team for the last, I think, 3 years during the sort of consultation process, talking to stakeholders in the industry to get their views. So we are, I just want to reassure you that we do take this very seriously, because we do see this is a very major piece of the legislation. So, and I think, to be clear, your original question is why don't we use one of the existing schemes? We haven't ruled anything out.
I was just going to say, I didn't say that. I said, okay. Can you reassure me that you haven't ruled out the option of expanding the existing service to cover this rather than just reinventing the wheel?
And I want to be clear that we haven't ruled that out, no.
Right, good. That's very helpful. Thank you. And we've talked about duplication already, but how would you ensure that the new ombudsman or an expanded existing ombudsman doesn't duplicate the work of local authorities and courts in this area as well?
Yeah, that again is something that's really important, because obviously local authorities have that selective licensing scheme in some areas. They have existing powers, and there are existing localised schemes, and so this will all need to come during the implementation of the bill. Of course, we will do the primary legislation, we will take the powers, we will make sure that they are powerful enough, I think that's the right word, they are sufficient for what's needed. But then we will have to work very carefully through the implementation plan, which will involve, as you've rightly said, guidance to local authorities, communication with them, making sure that all the different actors in the schemes understand who will be looking over them to see how they're performing, and also, most importantly, for the actual renter themselves. Is it clear to them?
Yeah, I personally think that clarity issue is incredibly important with this. So we've talked about the option of the existing letting agents redress scheme being expanded, but what were the main legal and practical challenges the government would face if it was to include letting agents within a new Ombudsman's remit that wasn't the existing redress scheme?
So I can give you sort of high-level sense that there are some quite significant administrative challenges, such as 2P transfers for the members of staff. Perhaps, Guy, you could add to that.
Yeah, so in terms of letting agents redress schemes, we already have two which are in existence. They've been in existence since 2014. They serve a purpose and do that we think well. Ultimately, whoever provides the new Ombudsman service, it is likely to be an existing organisation, whether that would be the Housing Ombudsman Service or perhaps one of the existing letting agents redress schemes. So what we are keen to try and do in setting up the service is to ensure that there is that can function without causing a lot of disruption to other existing schemes which are out there. So as the Minister has said, if you start to change the remit of one existing scheme so that it provides the service, etc., then that can cause unnecessary duplication and confusion. So across the piece, we are looking to see who is interested in delivering this service. As part of the decision on who will provide that service, we will have a look and see, as the Minister says, what is their infrastructure and what is their capacity to deliver that. But we aren't ruling anything out at this stage. So it is possible that one of the existing redress schemes could deliver this.
You are alive, are you not, to the danger of an expanded, newly created state body, therefore covering so much that letting agents and others say that there's no point supporting their redress scheme because you've got this one that covers everybody?
Yeah. Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
So
I think the point you're making is if things are working well already, you'd be concerned about us saying, okay, stop that and now join a different scheme.
Yes,
yeah.
Because letting agents have put a lot of time and effort
Yeah.
into doing this, providing the comfort that it provides to their tenants already.
Yeah.
Just one extra thing. I mean, it's outside the scope of this bill for us to do a big reorganisation of all the different ombudsmen across. I mean, that would be a very significant piece of work to bring everybody together into a single ombudsman. We don't think that, we haven't legislated the powers to do that. That may be a question for further down the line. But for the moment, our priority is to make sure that we get a good redress scheme for private renters as soon as possible.
Right, so looking at local authorities, many people on this committee are very familiar with, the no new burdens doctrine is a very important part of, at least in theory, allowing local authorities to cope with central government's mission creep and therefore additional burdens that are placed upon local authorities' budgets, which are already under a lot of pressure. This has the potential, if some of the things within it are actually going to be seriously enforced rather than simply on the bill and then ignored, to cost local authorities and their licensing departments some serious resource. So how do you plan to ensure that local authorities have those resources, and do you as a department acknowledge that this is an additional burden for local authorities and therefore falls under that doctrine?
Absolutely. So every time we legislate, we have to take account of the new burdens doctrine, as you've said. We have to make sure that local authorities, through all the work that goes on within the department, is providing the funding that they need. I think also it's worth reflecting that what we hope to do over the longer term is create a self-funding, sustainable system. There will, of course, be civil penalties which can be levied, So there is revenue obviously flowing into government from that. There will also, we anticipate, be a small cost for landlords to be a member of the proposed ombudsman that we have. And so what we want to do, obviously there would be no cost for tenants to join such a scheme, but we are aware of the enforcement burden and the resource that will require. So that, of course, is part of the general conversations that we have in terms of local government financing. And I think Stephanie wants to come in.
Yeah, I just obviously you've got a huge experience of working with local authorities, but one of the things that we've been doing is a funding project for a number of pathfinder areas that's really looking at innovative methods of enforcement, recognising there really is capability and expertise across the areas. And those 9 areas at the moment are looking at projects and seeing the extent to which different practices offers the most effective way of enforcement and sharing that best practice among each other. And so that's one of the things that we're doing at the moment in advance of legislation.
I'll suggest to you that it's not necessarily the case that the tenant won't pay for it, because if the landlord's having a levy imposed upon him, I would suggest his most obvious source of funding that would be through the rent. So how can landlords have some degree of confidence that this isn't just going to be used as some sort of additional taxation, particularly given that there are 11 million people who are likely to fall into this, and therefore it is likely to have a large cost? And is there some way, therefore, of having a polluter pays principle, that local authorities can keep and fine heavily the proceeds of those who are doing very much the wrong thing within the private sector, rather than an additional high cost on the vast majority of private landlords who get on with delivering a good job for their tenants?
Can I just check that I've given you the correct information, Mr. Lewitt, about the cost? Are we proposing a cost to join the scheme?
So the Ombudsman...
For the Ombudsman?
Yes, so we are proposing for there to be a cost, but it's also going to be a non-profit organisation. We're not setting up an Ombudsman to make a profit from its work.
Well, government's a non-profit organisation. It costs people a lot of money.
Yes.
Hopefully provide a service.
So your point about the polluter pays, in your example, who the polluter here is the bad landlord. Yes. I mean, I think sort of to take a step back, the whole purpose of what we're doing here is to introduce a system that's more efficient, which will help local authorities identify those bad landlords more quickly, because we know that there are some. Obviously, the vast majority are not bad, but there are some. And at the moment, we know through the various systems that exist, it can be very difficult for local authorities to actually find those bad landlords and enforce. So the big picture here, and the key thing, is that we want local authorities to be able to more quickly go after them and obviously prevent the harm to the tenant that living in a bad property with a bad landlord is causing, and then more quickly get that into the courts and get the fines, which will then help the local authorities resource their enforcement team activity.
Thank you very much.
Have you done any assessment of the likely increase in complaints from tenants to local authorities once tenants know they can't be evicted for making a complaint?
It's specifically that they can't be evicted for making a complaint.
Currently, a tenant who complains to a landlord is concerned that a few days later, a few weeks later, Section 21 notice arrives.
Yes.
When that can't happen, tenants are much more likely to feel confident about going to the local authority if the landlord isn't carrying out repairs.
Yes.
Have you done any calculation, estimate as to what that increase is likely to be?
Yes, that's been part of the work with stakeholders and our own analysis. Perhaps Guy can comment in a bit more detail?
Yes, so I think what you're referring to there is in terms of the additional cost or cases going to local authorities, that would be part of a new burdens assessment. We have recently published our impact assessment, which is what is on the cost to landlords and the benefits of our package as a whole. So I think that's what... Does that sound right?
That's right. I don't think there's a specific assessment of exactly how that will translate, but I think an understanding that I think at the moment we know that sometimes tenants won't raise a complaint to their own landlord, regardless of the local authority, but actually one of the things, the benefits of removing Section 1 will encourage tenants to engage with their own landlord to initially resolve the complaints, and that will be one of the benefits. And certainly part of the new burdens assessment will be to understand the full range of the legislation and what that means in terms of how that might material to the changes of impacts on local authorities themselves. But it could equally manifest itself in terms of the ability to contact the Ombudsman, as we've talked about earlier.
So you haven't done that new burdens assessment as yet?
We haven't finalised it. We've certainly started the process of that, but that's ongoing as we refine the legislation, and we work very closely with local authorities to make sure we sort of capture that effectively.
Within the new burdens assessment, have you yet started any calculations about how many more people are likely to contact the local authority to ask for their enforcement powers to be used as a result of this legislation?
We've done a broad assessment of the types of things that will change in terms of the enforcement picture, and picking up those a range of things that will change in the relationship, the way that local authorities will undertake itself. And so a key element of the legislation is the ability to charge fees, so there's sort of £5,000 for initial breaches and up to £30,000 for more serious offences, and understanding that will be one of the key elements, and I'll come back to some of the pathfinders that we were talking about, which may be able to support that understanding.
Seem to be evading the question, if I might say so. I mean, have you started to do the calculations as part of the new burdens assessment?
We've started the process of assessing the new burdens.
And how much the level of enforcement is likely to rise or request for enforcement as a result of the abolition of Section 21?
That's part of the process of feeding into that, and that's what we're discussing with local authorities.
Or are you going to do it?
We've started that discussion, certainly with local authorities, and feeding that process.
Okay. That's one of the questions. How much discussion have you had with the Ministry of Justice, your colleagues there, about getting the courts to actually award proper costs in these cases? It's often the case. Local authorities are short of resources. They take cases on, they spend a lot of money, they get a court, and they find the judge awards them half the cost they asked for, or a notional amount. In other words, that money comes out of the budgets local authorities have got to take on other cases in the future.
Oh, so you're talking about the award of costs in this particular instance. Okay. So I haven't had specific discussions with them on that point. I've had discussions with them generally on the court system and their digitalisation process. But I think that's a very good point. I'll be sure to have that conversation with them next time I have a meeting.
It's an important point that authorities are raising all the time.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Okay, let's move on now to the court process. Ian.
Thanks, Chair. In the enforcer's absence, Minister, of a specialist housing court, which the committee recommended, what plans does the government have to ensure that existing courts can process possession claims efficiently, given the introduction of the new possession grounds?
Yes, thank you for that, Ian. So we obviously thought very carefully about the issue of the specialist housing court, but our view of the view of our colleagues in the Ministry of Justice was that it wouldn't be the best way of achieving the outcome that we all want. And I think the argument that they presented to us was that it doesn't really matter what issue a particular department is working on, that will be a priority for that department. And obviously we've just seen a statement from the Home Office Minister about rape and serious sexual assault, so of course we all agree that's a priority, but in a sense they have to make those judgments themselves. So we work very closely with them, and I think what's important is the outcome of the changes that are being made. So we are having a series of discussions with colleagues in the MOJ. There's the minister that leads on the tribunal system is Mike Freer. We meet with him regularly, as well as meeting with the Justice Secretary himself. I think Secretary of State has met with Master of the Rolls and the Lord Chief Justice as well, and the assurances have been given to us that actually the sort of pandemic-related backlogs are now largely tackled, and so the courts are now working pretty well. But we need to give assurances to the whole sector that when we introduce this, which is a very big change, the courts will be able to cope with it. So we've been quite clear that we want to align our changes with the courts being ready to cope with any potential volume of cases.
With that vein of information from yourselves to the MOJ, we had a witness in the previous session say that he spoke to members of the judiciary recently, and they were none the wiser about how it's going to work. They didn't seem to have much information. So are you slightly concerned that your good intentions with the MOJ are feeding into the judiciary? Are we worried about that?
They won't be. I will ask Guy in a minute, but I'll just make my point, if I may, that I think that it's probably accurate to say that the judiciary at this point don't have full sight of all the guidance and their professional, I think it's called their bench book, and all the other professional tools that they need. That's because we're not at the point where it can be provided, because that initial work is still ongoing with the MOJ, which is why I've been clear that needs to happen, that needs to take place, and they need time to do that. Of course, they need to disseminate it through their own hierarchies. But we want to work with them, and I think this digitalisation process is going to make a big difference in the longer term. So I think we need to give that assurance to people listening to this, that when the system comes in place, the judges will know what's going on, the courts will know what's going on, and people can get redressed more quickly. But Guy, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think that's the answer.
Okay.
That's okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So you're confident there's going to be a seamless transition to the new legislation, yeah?
Well, we're certainly putting every effort in at this point to make sure that it is, because we are aware that this is a major part of the reform, and the court system is a key thing for tenants and for landlords. So it's absolutely in our interest to make sure that it is ready. And I think the Justice Secretary has been very clear in his commitments to our Secretary of State that he's very on board with this whole reform process.
Just on that, the conversation's been had with the Justice Secretary about the complete lack as well of representation out there, because the dearth of housing solicitors, certainly, and legal representation within Liverpool is remarkable, considering what we've actually got with the issues. We've actually worked with a local law centre to fund a housing solicitor from my office, because there was nothing out there. So is that also conversations, because I feel as though that'll be a huge part of making this happen, correct representation, potentially heads off even going to court, because you've got that expertise. At the moment it's not out there, obviously because of reforms that have been over the last decade, and lapso and destruction basically of legal aid. Are we having them conversations, Minister, with regards to this?
Yes, we are, and I'm aware that the MOJ are they're of course aware of the potential changes to what is needed to be provided, and they are launching, they've informed me, a new service called Housing Loss Prevention Service, which I think will probably do what you're saying, is try and prevent homelessness before it happens. The service is going to be launched on the 1st of August. It will enable anyone facing eviction or repossession to receive free, non-means tested early legal advice, and the aim is to support tenants to stay in their home if possible, and it's in addition to the free advice already offered on the day of the hearing. So my understanding is that they have actually increased their investment into civil legal aid, figure of £830 million last year. But in terms of their own budgets, that's obviously a matter for them. But they've made us aware of this particular service, which we think is very well aligned to what we're doing here in this piece of legislation.
Look at that with interest, I'm sure the committee will as well. So can you confirm that the measures regarding improvements to the courts, what we've just outlined, will be aligned with the abolition of Section 21 and the new possession grounds?
Yes, absolutely. We've said that publicly, and that's our position.
Excellent. And how will you ensure the definition of antisocial behaviour in the bill is clear enough to address the issue?
So this is obviously an area of huge interest, and an antisocial behaviour is a difficult one, obviously, to make policy and legislation on, because it's so wide-ranging. And what we anticipate happening is that, and this is what we've heard from landlords, they want a slightly wider definition of antisocial behaviour to be able to capture the issues where there are a small minority of bad tenants, We know that obviously most tenants look after the homes that they're in, but there are some, unfortunately, we're talking about the human race, that don't. So we need to give landlords the confidence that when we've removed Section 21, if someone is behaving in an antisocial way, they can still evict that person from their property. So that's why we have lowered the threshold for the discretionary ground, but we do believe it is ultimately a matter of judicial discretion. It does need to be heard in a court, purely because antisocial behaviour is so wide-ranging. There's so many different things, and I think the other point I would make about it is it's really important that it's not conflated with domestic abuse, and that we don't, the point's been made to me many times, that we don't have a disproportionate or negative impact on somebody who may be experiencing domestic abuse. So we have to be sensitive in this area.
With regard to lowering the threshold, he's slightly concerned, like a lot of people are, that potentially Section 8 could replace Section 21 as a tool which enforces the imbalance of power of what we've got between tenant and landlord. Is that something which concerns you, that could be replicated, Section 21? Because we all wanted Section 21 to go, but where we are with Section 8, is that a concern?
So I think everything that we hear
for bad landlords, not all, but bad landlords could utilise as a loophole.
So what I want to say is that everything that we hear from this committee and parliamentarians is a concern that we take seriously, because we know that every single MP has got vast experience of housing. And that's why we set up a quite extensive antisocial behaviour working group, where we've got a wide range of stakeholders who are advising us, telling us what their experience is like on the front line, helping us create the guidance that we will be disseminating in the process of implementing the bill, and also just helping us to understand some of these key issues, like the balance of power and like, for instance, domestic abuse, which is something that's, I think, is really important that we get right.
Thanks, yeah.
Okay, Kate, come forward.
Just very quickly, from experience, it's always very difficult for people to gather evidence of antisocial behaviour, and it can actually take months. Are you suggesting you've reduced the standard that's accepted by a court to make it easier?
So I'll probably ask Guy to talk a bit more, but what I'm saying is that the antisocial behaviour possession ground will be a discretionary ground for a judge to decide in a court of law. And that
but a judge needs quite a lot of evidence right now.
Yes, that's right. Guy, can you say a bit more about the evidence threshold?
Sure, so happy to do that. So on the discretionary antisocial behaviour ground, we have heard when you're talking to stakeholders and to the NRLA and others, that landlords do find it quite hard sometimes to be able to evidence antisocial behaviour. And therefore, by making the change that we have said we will do, which is to expand it so that it brings in a wider set of behaviours, while maintaining judicial discretion, that should help landlords who are genuinely trying to deal with a problem tenant who obviously causes a great deal of pain and anxiety for the landlord and their neighbours as well. So we think that is balanced. We think it's balanced alongside the work we're doing, as the Minister says, with the Antisocial Behaviour Working Group to try and make sure that's right. So we are taking measures to help landlords prove genuine antisocial behaviour. That's discretionary, and we're also maintaining our mandatory antisocial behaviour ground, which is where there has been a proven criminal offence.
When do you think the committee can have evidence of what you're proposing?
We're very happy to come forward to the committee. I don't think we've got anything published at this point, have we?
We'll have what's in the legislation, and as the legislation progresses, for guidance, we'll say guidance a lot during the session, for guidance that we're working on, we will develop, and we want to make sure that's right ahead of implementation. So, be happy to share that as it develops with the committee and to take your views.
Intending to bring into alignment the antisocial behaviour guidance for social housing along with private sector, so they're the same?
I'm going to have to ask Guy to answer that. I know that we've done a huge amount of work in this sector. I don't know that it'll be exactly the same.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to give a full answer to that. I know that's something you've raised before, I believe, Chairman, about the interplay. Clearly, we don't want to be in a position where tenants in social housing or tenants in private rented sector are being treated very differently. It may be that at the moment that there are some differences in how that works. We'll want to test that out, and happy to bring further information about that. But ultimately what we're trying to do is deal with the private rented sector, get that right, and make sure that it works for that sector. Obviously, I think social housing is slightly different in that there's greater security of tenure, and that may be how the rules differ slightly.
There isn't, is there? Once Section 21 is abolished, there's the same security of tenure for the private sector. Yeah. So why is the difference on the grounds for antisocial behaviour eviction?
So, well, I mean, the Renters Reform Bill, is only dealing with the private rented sector. Yes. It doesn't touch what the situation in the social landlords at all. So what we're introducing here is only for private landlords.
Right. So you have two tenants side by side, housing association tenants, one the housing association managing as a private tenancy, and next door they're managing as a social housing tenancy. And the two tenants next door with the same landlord end up with completely different rules for antisocial behaviour.
I mean, obviously, when you put it like that, any kind of edge case is. I mean, I think in reality, it's not going to be that different in the day-to-day experience. I mean, what we want to do is improve the system for the person who's not with the social landlord and make sure that they get a better experience than they currently have, and remove that threat of the retaliatory eviction, so that they do get that good service. And let's hope it is a good landlord, and they won't need to go to the Ombudsman. But if they did, that would be there for them.
Yeah, but we're at the courts now, aren't we? Which is, well, I mean, could we have a note on this at some point? I think it's an area which is probably worthy of further exploration.
Absolutely, very happy to do that. It's a hugely vast area.
Yeah, I understand.
Yes.
Just one comment on that, because there is a concern that a judge will be making a decision on two sets of circumstances, and as the chair said, it could be neighbours, because you said the courts would agree a process for evicting people based on antisocial behaviour rules that you're going to change, but only for one set of people. How would a judge making a legal decision?
I mean, I can't really, if you'll forgive me, committee, I can't really comment on the repossession grounds in the social housing sector. That's not an area I'm expert on at this point. But what I can say is, in terms of the private rented sector, a tenant in the private rented sector, we are going to make sure that we have provided that guidance for the justice system before the bill is implemented, through working with stakeholders and making sure that we've captured all the concerns that have been raised by this committee and others. And then it will be for a judge to make a decision, as it is at the moment in a case where someone is in front of a court.
Mr. Horsington has promised to come back with a note for us. And I think also, Minister, you promised before in session 2, come back with a note, I think, about the issue of domestic abuse. So where an individual is suffering from that, it doesn't get mixed up as a problem of antisocial behaviour. I think that's something else that you're going to come back to us with as well.
I apologise if that hasn't been picked up. My private office are here with me, so we will definitely pick that up and make sure that you have a note.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, moving on. Bob.
Yeah, Minister, can I just advise you, I've got a string of landlords who've complained to me that they've got tenants that haven't paid their rent for more than 12 months, they commit antisocial behaviour, and they still haven't got a court date. So good luck in getting the backlog of court dates. And in fact, one of the most egregious comments came over the weekend from a landlord who, when everyone in the area is complaining about a particular tenant, he says, well, I can't do anything about the tenant because we can't get a court date. So it's making an awful lot of people's lives a misery right now. Mm-hmm. And unless this is very clear and speeded up, then this isn't going to, I don't think it's going to help at all. I don't expect you to comment on that because obviously it's anecdotal, but this is going on in a large number of places. Yeah. And I think we've got concerns about this. Now, in terms of abolishing Section 21, which is the headline, obviously, of this bill, the bill sets out the notice periods for the new possession grounds. So does that give sufficient protection to tenants, in your view? And if so, why?
So I think it's an issue that's been hotly debated in this committee and elsewhere and in Parliament, and I think there will be a range of views on this. And what we've had to do, the task we've had to do, is try and think about all of those views and look at it through the lens of trying to redress the balance of power between a good landlord and a good tenant, as well as a bad landlord and a bad tenant, because of course we have to think about all of these. And just as there are, bad tenants, bad landlords, we need to think about how this plays out in someone's home, and also how it impacts on someone's asset, their property that they've bought and paid for and maintained. So these are not easy or straightforward black and white decisions.
Correct.
But you've asked me, do I think we've got the balance right? And ultimately, yes, I think we have. We've given it considerable thought. We've also taken into account the different circumstances that people who are landlords have presented us with, saying that there are lots of things that would mean that they would need to regain possession of their property in some quite individual and specific circumstances to do with different types of land and property, and also, for example, employment-related grounds. And so we have considered all of those different things. And then at the same time, we've also considered the needs of tenants for security, and more security than they currently have, because a Section 21 could be issued at any time. And then also balance that with the needs of landlords, because landlords may need to liquidate their investment, especially at the moment with the current turbulence in markets and with mortgages. But you're very welcome to sort of probe me specifically, and I'm sure you will do in the parliamentary
Just taking the last point
debates.
you made. All right, so it's perfectly possible as a landlord, if you're on a buy-to-let basis, a lot of buy-to-let providers, in terms of mortgage providers, will allow you to transfer the property to someone else together with a sitting tenant, particularly if they've paid their rent and are good tenants and good behaviour. So why allow a position whereby the landlord has to evict a tenant who might be a very good tenant just for the purposes of selling the property?
We will not be requiring that unless there's some sort of specific arrangement in the mortgage deed, but that our primary legislation will not necessarily mean that a landlord has to evict a tenant. I think I'm right in saying that.
It wouldn't require, but this would be grounds for that position. Why not have a position whereby the landlord would have to establish that actually the lender wouldn't allow the position, which would protect the tenants and potentially allow the tenants to continue with a different landlord?
Sorry, I'm struggling to understand exactly what you
want
to change.
At the moment, the current position is obviously the grounds that a landlord could choose to evict a tenant
is if they're selling the property.
I wish to sell the property.
Yes.
With vacant possession. But if the landlord has a mortgage with a company that permits it to be sold with that, and a prospective buyer also has the position whereby they can acquire that, what's to stop that? Nothing. However, the landlord could, quite rightly, just use the means to evict. I'm looking at reasons why people shouldn't have to evict and shouldn't evict.
I mean, I think I understand the challenge, but I think on the other hand, we have to, at a certain point, leave it to the incentives of economic incentives and responsibility of each person. So I don't know why a landlord would do that. If it's a tenant paying rent is a good tenant, surely that's going to help that landlord sell that property.
Well, yeah, exactly. However, so the landlord gives notice, evicts the tenant, and then tries to sell the property. Now, how long does that landlord then have to leave the property on the market before they say, I'm not getting any interest, I'll re-let the property?
I think we've said...
You've said at the moment.
I think we said 6 months.
Earlier today we've had evidence that period is not long enough in the bill.
What? So, Stephanie,
right,
sorry.
So we've said that there should be a 3-month restriction
thank you, yes.
on being able to re-let a property once you've evicted a tenant in order to sell it. But I'm not sure, are you talking about whether or not we should be encouraging landlords to sell properties with existing sitting tenants as being a positive
what I'm saying
thing?
Is
we would encourage that.
Yeah.
We do encourage prospective buyers to not see a sitting tenant as being a negative.
One way of establishing that is that the person who is that's selling the property, if they've got a requirement, if they sell the property, that they have to sell with vacant possession, or the purchaser can only get a mortgage with vacant possession, that obviously changes the position. But if someone comes in and says, well, I can buy this property, don't need vacant possession, then the landlord doesn't need to evict the tenant.
But that's currently the scenario, isn't it?
It's going to be a very confusing picture.
I don't think we're forcing landlords to evict a tenant before they can sell the property. I think we would encourage tenants to be, be there while the property changes hands. But ultimately, it's for a landlord to make that decision about whether or not they do want to sell the property with a tenant. I mean, and we have protections in that.
Yeah, I mean, there might be a legitimate reason. I mean, it's impossible to really think about all the different reasons. A landlord, obviously, it is their property. They might think, well, actually, I need to evict this tenant so I can do some major repairs, for example, and then I want to sell it on because I can get a better price in the market. And, in a sense, I feel like actually legislating to require them to sell it with a sitting tenant is just beyond what I think is the right thing to do.
Okay, I mean, there are lots of grounds where this is potentially going to be a problem. One of the concerns that I think a lot of people have is that a landlord will use the means of saying, I'm going to sell the property, I'm going to move my family in, or whatever, and then
not do it,
subsequently not do it, and then the tenants at the moment will be the only ones that are informed about this, and of course they've gone away, they've probably gone to another property, and then the landlord relets, and no one will know about it, so no one can take any action because the local authority will be going too much for us to handle. What is to stop that as being a backdoor means of an eviction?
I think there are a couple of things that I would say to that, and I think first of all it's a fair challenge, and it's something that we are working through in terms of how we, again back to the courts, if it is challenged in court, how we then make it clear to the judiciary that how do they measure these periods and how do they actually process that through the courts. But first of all, obviously we are going to allow tenants to go to the courts if they feel that ground has been used inappropriately. Secondly, we are going to have the Ombudsman that we've just said, which can provide advice to tenants and to landlords on their rights, so it gives them a sense of what their rights are in the situations such as you've described and others. And I think also, finally, it is up to us to communicate to landlords and tenants and local authorities that this is a change in the law. These things are not acceptable. And if you feel your landlord is behaving in a way that's breaking potentially in breach of the law and the new law, then there is a risk that they will go to court. And I think, I personally believe most people in this country, most are decent law-abiding people and will not willfully break the law. Obviously some do, which is why we have to make laws. But what we know at the moment is that actually when landlords are serving notices on tenants, most tenants do abide by them, and most landlords give a good service, and most tenants look after the property. So I think that within that general statement, if we actually educate people...
And we were hearing earlier, although it's anecdotal, that most tenants that receive a notice leave well before the courts even take action.
Yeah.
And so therefore just the serving of notices often triggers people to leave. Can I just ask one more question, which is this committee recommended longer periods of time for notice. In particular, the government haven't looked at the requirement in the bill to live in a property for at least 4 months before giving the 2-month leaving notice, which was what we recommended originally. Obviously, that gives a period of occupancy for tenants to have before they serve notice. Why is that not the case?
So you're talking about before landlords can evict, is that what can serve any eviction ground? Yeah. Yes, and you recommended 4, and we're currently on 2. Is that what you're talking about? Okay. So, I mean, I go back to what I said. There's a lot of views on this. We consulted for something like 3 years and took huge amounts of evidence. Clearly, that is perhaps what you'd characterise as something that's more of a pro-landlord measure. Being able to remove tenants more quickly, but I think our basic belief behind that was actually it's very expensive for a tenant to move. And it's actually quite expensive for a landlord to find a good tenant. So, if they've actually found a good situation on either side, there's very strong economic incentives not to move. But on the other hand, if unfortunately there is a very bad tenant and it is causing a huge issue, we do think that landlords ought to be able to exercise their rights to regain their property without suffering any more financial loss. I think this goes to the sort of all the kind of supply issues that we are also being told by landlords who are worried that this is going to damage landlords' confidence. We do need to give landlords confidence that if they rent their property out and things go wrong, under certain limited circumstances.
At the moment, London councils, for example, have put forward evidence that suggests that in London and across the country, the amount of family housing that's now available on the private sector is dropping rapidly, and landlords are withdrawing from the market. Those properties don't appear, I may be wrong, don't appear to be being sold to own occupiers, but it does appear that the Airbnb market has really taken off, with people then getting very large amounts of rent for short periods of time with no protection for tenants whatsoever, and landlords go, well, there are tax advantages as well potentially, so they can get a lot of advantages from doing this rather than providing the long-term tenancies that we all want to see. Is the government going to take any action on regulating that market within this bill or as a separate measure?
It's a separate measure, but we are taking action on it. So I want to say two things on that. I mean, obviously we hear a lot of anecdotal commentary about landlords leaving the market, but we don't have hard evidence of that. So the evidence that we do have, the data that we do have, suggests that the market is still growing. There's always going to be a churn in any market, but I'm sure that one of my officials can help me with the actual numbers. But we are not aware of any of the sort of more significant consequences that some people have pointed to. On your point about are we legislating on the Airbnb and the short-term holiday let market, yes we are. The position is slightly different in London, I think, because they already have some restrictions on what they can do in London with respect for Airbnb, but we are doing two things in that area, which is being done by our colleagues in DCMS, one of which is to potentially bring in a register of all the properties in a holiday let area, so that local authorities will actually know which properties are being holiday lets and which are private long-term residential lets. And then also we are looking at bringing in planning permission restrictions for local authorities to put a halt to the amount of properties in their area that can be let onto the holiday market, Airbnb and others. So that's not part of the Renters Reform Bill, but it's a separate piece of work that's going on in government to deal with exactly that issue.
Well, just to quote you from London councils directly, the number of properties of 1 to 4 bedrooms is 41% down on the 2017 average on the private rented sector. So that's hard data from London.
Right.
And across the listing of 4-bedroom properties with big family housing, which is down 47% over the same period. And the rents are 20% higher, because obviously as the volume is less available. And the problem is that it's very clear that landlords are withdrawing from the market, certainly in London. We're taking this view across the country as well. So there's less supply, it appears, but it's not being sold to owner-occupiers. The Airbnb market, therefore, is taking off. And this seems to have happened since the government made announcements on abolishing Section 21. And you also heard DLUC questions today, the increase of Section 21 notices going on in advance of the bill. So this seems to be creating more of a problem than it's solving. And unless action is taken, I can take you to parts of London. Camden Council, for example, I did a bit of a study on this. Huge numbers of Airbnb. Now, Camden might be a very nice place, but it's not a holiday let area, with due respect. The average property price is £1 million in any case, and the Airbnb market has taken off. This is a really serious problem, not just in London, but across the cities. And unless this is addressed, I think, in this bill, then actually we won't solve the problem.
I think all of what you said, I wouldn't disagree with those broad challenges, especially in London. Obviously, it's a different market to many other areas of the country, but it has similarities to some of the more expensive areas of the country. All of these things are interconnected. There's not one single thing taken in isolation, I don't believe, and no one's been able to actually prove this is the case, that is having the impacts that you've suggested. We are in a time of economic headwinds. We've got high interest rates. People's mortgages are more expensive. So there's huge pressure on housing generally. We've also got influxes of people that need housing from Afghan, from Ukraine, etc. So, of course, there is a supply and demand issue. What I would say, I do not believe, and no one has been able to actually, beyond any doubt, prove that that has got anything to do with the very proportionate and modest reforms that we are making to removing Section 21, which is something that we committed to do in our manifesto, and which is there to protect decent, hard-working tenants who need to live in a house against a rogue landlord. That's my belief, but I'm sure we will debate these issues in Parliament.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
Right, okay. Would it be helpful to include the measures on Airbnb in the same legislation so we've got a wider picture of the whole sector?
I just don't think it's possible in the way that legislation works. The Airbnb planning permission measures, I'll have to come back to you with a note on the precise detail of what we're doing on that. But the consultation, I don't think, is finished yet, unless my officials...
It's finished, but it's being considered.
It's being considered, thank you.
I think the planning use changes might be allowed through secondary legislation rather than doing it in primary legislation.
Right, okay.
So, it'd be helpful to have a note on how the two connect.
I think it would be helpful for us to write a note to you on that one.
Right, just move on to just a final couple of issues.
Lords vote.
It's all right, we're safe. Student accommodation. You've taken the purpose-built student accommodation out of the changes, so you can have fixed-term tenancies there. But lots of student accommodation, of course, is not in purpose-built accommodation. It's in regular accommodation for HMOs.
Yes.
A lot of concern around, and I went to a meeting of the student ABVG the other day, a very good discussion, sensible discussion about the challenges in this area, but a lot of concern that there's already a shortage of student accommodation in many universities. Come September, if you not exempted student accommodation from the changes to tenancies and made them all open-ended, then lots of that accommodation could just disappear and won't be available come September. Obviously not this year, but in future Septembers.
Yes. So I fully agree that we need to think very carefully about how we treat student accommodation, and I've had lots of discussions with colleagues who represent particularly university areas, and this committee and others have made it very clear to all of us, myself, ministers and the department, that there are lots of people who are just small private landlords who just may be renting to students, solely just to students, so they are effectively student landlords, and the last thing we want to do is have a negative impact on them, because they're a very important part of the offer. So we are currently considering exactly how we will treat them during the passage of the bill. We have been exhorted and called upon to introduce something specific to deal with this, and we are looking at that very, very carefully with a great deal of interest. I think that's as far as I can go on that one.
Now, at least it's still under consideration. That's helpful.
Yes.
I think the other point needs to be made absolutely clear that, and some students saw accommodation possibly being exempted from the changes that are proposed in the bill as being student accommodation would have lower standards.
Yes.
That whether it's open-ended tenancies or fixed-term tenancies, I think it just needs to be point needs to be made very clear that students would have the same rights as tenants, the same standards as any other form of accommodation.
Completely right, and we know that many students, unfortunately, some of them do live in quite shocking conditions, and it has a massive impact on their studies, and often they're away from home and all of that. So all of the other measures that we're bringing in, all the different redress schemes, the different standards, improving the way that landlords have to operate, will benefit students, even if there's a slightly different cycle for repossessing the property.
That's
for
a
them.
really helpful comment, Minister. Thank you. Right, moving on to housing quality as the last issue. Kate.
Thanks, Chair. There's some data saying that 23% of private rented properties do not meet the decent housing standard. We're told there's going to be a cap of £10,000 to meet the measures to what you consider a decent standard. Do you think that 10,000 is going to be enough?
I'm sorry, can you explain what the 10,000 is? Sorry, and I might have to ask Stephanie, what can you just clarify?
There's a £10,000 cap to carry out necessary improvements. There's over 1 million houses that don't meet the standard. So how confident are you that £10,000 is going to be adequate?
If you don't mind, I'm going to ask Stephanie to comment on this particular point.
So I think you're referring to the energy efficiency measures, where there's a proposal for a 10,000 cap on...
3 measures, isn't there?
Sorry. So the current system within energy performance is the private rented sector is subject to requirement to meet the minimum energy efficiency standards of EPCE, and there's a cost cap of that at the moment of £3,500 for landlords. And in the government consulted, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero have consulted on extending that, and that was where the reference to a 10,000 cost cap is. We have consulted on introducing the decent home standard into the private rented sector, but haven't specifically proposed a cost cap, but did ask for views and opinions on the way in which that should be considered as part of our ongoing consideration.
So, but you think £10,000 will be enough? How are you going to support landlords who just do not currently have the resources to meet the standards?
Are you talking about the energy performance certificate? I presume you're talking about the energy.
Just to meet your decent standard of housing.
Yeah. So
because it's not just energy, is it? There's
no. I mean, there are various sources of government help for landlords whose houses don't meet the various thresholds across the regulatory system. So, you know, we recognise that they may need some help to do that, and there are various government schemes available. And also we've provided help to tenants as well. So I think it's something like £12 billion in help to heat schemes across the various tenures, so boiler upgrade, sustainable warmth, home upgrade grants, in social housing and social housing decarbonisation fund.
Sorry, I'm talking about private sector.
Private sector, yes.
Meeting the decent home standard.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So, how are you going to support landlords to meet those standards?
Well, some of what I've just said will be available for landlords, some of those pots of money. But ultimately, we do expect we would expect landlords to rent homes that are decent. Ultimately, obviously, they will have to meet some of it from their own resources. I think there are some discrete funding pots that are available for landlords, but I think also an important part of what we're doing will be information for landlords, being very clear about what's expected and by when, because there are standards that are coming in at various points in time. So we will expect landlords to upgrade homes where they need to be upgraded.
And again, it'd be helpful if the committee had information actually on the proposals, what the timescales for meeting standards are, and if there is any financial support for landlords to get the houses to those standards.
Yes, we are still working through the detail of the decent homes standard. It wasn't in the bill at first reading because, again, it's a complex area. We do need time to review the consultation responses and get it right. And as soon as we have got that information ready, we will, of course, make it available to the committee and to others.
And the various schemes that will be available.
And if there are any schemes, of course, we'll be able to point to those.
just finally, when do you think this bill will be brought back?
Oh, well, I think as the Chair observed, this is at the discretion of the business managers of the House.
I think my concern is there's, in each area, there's a lack of detail on how this will actually move forward. So I think the concern would be there's so much still required to work on, it could be delayed much longer than planned.
I hope it won't be delayed much longer than planned, because I think it's standard that when you introduce legislation, you introduce primary high-level legislation, and then, of course, there's always detail that follows through any legislation. I don't think this bill is unusual in that regard, because it does affect courts, landlords, tenants, local authorities, and that guidance, that secondary legislation and all of those things will be provided. And of course the House will see all of that when it comes to second reading. We will have to then publish all of the schedules that go along with the legislation, as we do with any legislation.
Okay, thank you.
Right, Mr. Thank you very much indeed for coming this afternoon.
Sure.
Once again answering a lot of detailed questions. I think the committee is aware there's a lot of work still going on
Yes.
on many of these issues, and we look forward to your thoughts on our recommendations at the earliest possible opportunity.
Indeed, we will once again.
And for the further notes that you promised today on a range of issues, I think it's clear that the committee has expressed its support for the principle behind the legislation.
Yes.
We just want to work to help as far as we can get this legislation right, so it delivers what we all hope it delivers. That's a better private rented sector for tenants, but also for landlords as well.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Chair and members of the committee.
Okay, thank you.
For your interest.
Order. That brings us to the end of our public proceedings for today.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.